to be recording this session. So you should have just heard the recording in progress. So it's my great pleasure to welcome everyone here today. For me, it's the evening over here in Australia. It's about 5:30 in the evening, but I know for my colleagues over in the UK and Italy and so forth, it's the morning. I would really like to welcome Dr. Tina Skinner of the University of Bath, Professor Jo Edson Ferry of University of Glasgow, Professor Caitlin Proctor of the Geneva Graduate Institute, Davisha Navadia of Raising Voices, Professor Genevieve Manel of University College London, and Dr. Elizabeth Orr of Brock University here tonight to talk about researcher wellbeing. Before we get into I keep going to say the evening because it is here, but into the webinar today, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge country. And that's something that we do here in Australia because of the traditional custodians of the countries that we work in and on. They've never ceded these lands. And so I would like to begin by acknowledging the Wadawurrung people of the Kulin Nations where I was raised, but also to acknowledge the Turrbal and Yagara people of the Meanjin Nation. And that's where I'm calling in from today. I pay my respects to all their elders, past, present, and emerging, and recognise that these lands have never been ceded. I am merely a visitor here on these lands. So what we're going to be doing today is talking about an issue that is very important to the group of us from across the globe. We really want to start having some more meaningful discussions about researcher wellbeing. And never has there been a more important time to be thinking about how we can look after not only ourselves as researchers, but our research teams. So we're really glad that everyone could join us here tonight. I'm going to hand over to Professor Tina Skinner to begin the webinar, and she will give you a little bit of an overview about what we're going to be doing, but also her background. Thank you, Tina.
Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. Okay, thank you very much for bringing this together, Renee. And we're first going to say a bit about our own positionality, and then we're going to talk a bit more about particular aspects of researcher wellbeing from particular perspectives. I'm going to give a kind of an overview, but I'm going to start with myself. I've done gender-based violence research for the last 30 years or so, but I also do work for the last 15 around disability work and wellbeing, and that's because I'm disabled, so I'm neurodiverse and have long-term pain. And in part, it was because of my work with gender-based violence and my work around disability and wellbeing that brought me to the researcher wellbeing work. But I'm also from a working class, white working class background, so that's part of my own positionality. But I'm going to talk mainly about my positionality in relation to my own experience of distress, secondary and vicarious trauma. And secondary trauma is primarily defined as when you witness something, a one-off event, either by listening or seeing, whereas vicarious trauma is a drip effect of the build-up of experiences. But both have basically the same outcome, which is suffering anxiety based from witnessing the trauma of others. And the symptoms for me were intrusion, so thinking about gender-based violence when I didn't intend to, avoidance, so I still avoid fiction and also news generally if it has gender-based violence in it, unless I put my work hat on. And I tried to drop out of gender-based violence research, but have been unsuccessful. Changes in cognition, so that existential angst, so that sense that this is an unsafe world once you've been exposed to these kinds of issues. And for me, particularly, very difficult to trust men with my children. And changes in mood. So when I was an early career researcher, I did research that involved young victim survivors' experiences of reporting to the police. And at that time, I felt soaked in their pain. So it was that kind of experience and trying to ensure that others didn't have those kinds of experiences without support was why I set up the Researcher Wellbeing Project, and also GW4RWell, which goes across Exeter, Bath, Bristol and Cardiff, and the Researcher Wellbeing Strategic Change Group. Can I have the next slide, please, Renee? In terms of the findings of the Researcher Wellbeing Project, we did a small scale study. And the great thing is that even despite these kinds of impacts, the majority of us are positive and passionate about the work that we do. But secondary and vicarious trauma symptoms were common across our sample. And less common, but still there, were also primary trauma. So people being direct victims of violence, for example. Not all of those experiences were seen as negative, and not everybody had substantial impact. So for some, it was like water off a duck's back. Anger drives us. Empathy can be really useful in our research, but there were 4 factors that did make a difference for those who were more substantially impacted. That was the level of training and knowledge that they had about how to cope, the level of control that they had over either the topic or the methods that they used, and the security of their posts. So people who have been on long-term rolling contracts, most impacted. Having shared experience with their respondents, and also other difficulties. So, for example, me being disabled or experiencing a death recently. Next slide, please. In terms of our recommendations, now my colleagues are going to be talking about these things in more depth. So Genevieve is going to be talking about institutional responses, for example. But it's so important to have a culture that is supportive of us, but also to have funding so that we have institutional strategies that focus on prevention, identification, and provision for secondary and vicarious trauma. At the micro level, we need academic supervision that's effective, that risk assessments have been done and planning is in place before we start our research. And then the support is available as we move forward, but also not to work in isolation. So even if there's just 2 in a team, the supervisor and the researcher, there has to be a team approach to the work. At the individual level, that's where researcher wellbeing plans come into play, and we've got guidance for that if you're interested. But this is a toolbox of options. So regular academic supervision, effective professional wellbeing services, and doing the things that we love, and seeing that not as something we're doing separately, but actually to be effective in our work, we need to go walking, swimming, do crochet, watch TV and veg out. You know, those things are great. But there are also things that we know less about, and that's some of my colleagues are going to talk about that today. So we don't know enough about lived experience researchers. We don't know enough about the difference that nation, culture, law, politics, being an Indigenous researcher or being a researcher overseas makes to our experience. Does it make it worse? And particularly, we don't know enough about early career researchers and PhD students and their experience. I'm going to hand over to my colleagues to say a bit more about those kinds of things. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name's Jo Edson-Ferry. I'm Professor of Sociology at the University of Glasgow. And I also have had a number of national roles across Scotland and across the UK around research methods generally, quantitative and qualitative. And I've been slowly trying to drive into these mainstream conversations the importance of emotional well-being. I'm going to start with my positionality, and I've sort of split this into 2 areas, risk and belonging. So I have privilege, and I want to declare that from the beginning. I'm cisgender, I'm heteronormative, I'm white, I'm European. I had access to a free university education. I have a passion for the research that I do. It's largely around human rights realization now, but it certainly looked at things that were challenging emotionally, including end-of-life research, disability experiences, and I also belong in the sense that I have been able to acquire leadership roles. I'm a professor of a prestigious university. I'm currently Associate Dean for Skill and Method. So there's a platform, and I want to talk about that a lot, because when I think about my risk, I'm a first generation student. My parents didn't go to university, and they spoke about my employment in an academic institution as being risky explicitly until I'm made professor. And that is very, that's good for me now that they finally, in my 50s, approve of my career. But for a long time, they were discouraging. And so It felt like a fight to stay in universities. I'm sure a lot of people share that experience, but that's reinforced often by the people around us. Emotionally demanding research was labour that I was doing on top of my research career. It was not acknowledged, it was not supported, and in fact, the opposite. The narrative was that I wasn't doing research in an intelligent way, because if I was doing it in an intelligent way, I would be doing emotionally neutral research because that was easier to do. And again, I had personal reasons why I had to engage in the research that I did. But then those employment narratives were undermining, and then there was just the misogyny that exists in the University of Glasgow. So interesting, the gender of the panel, so interesting, the gender of our participants. This is not an accidental thing. This is because we are at the brutal end of academia. I have had my ideas stolen. I've had income almost stolen. I've had outputs almost stolen. I've had to challenge that and contest that. So if we could go to the next slide, please. I wanted to talk about recognition and redistribution. What has to happen? So we've got so many messages of we need to be resilient, but from a leadership perspective, what are our institutions required to do for us to have equal opportunities within higher education or within civil society researcher? So I'm going to talk about recognition, and next slide, redistribution. We need role models who are celebrated, and those role models shouldn't be exemplified as superstars, but we should have practical strategies to get more people into leadership roles. So extend the ladder down. We need that. It needs to be pathways to success. We need policies that name the added labour. And as a minimum, this has to be established within our ethics committees. At Glasgow, we've recently launched a new committee for people who do scholarship of learning and teaching. And support, emotional demanding support, is written through every single application that comes to us. And it's not just about yourself as a researcher, it's how you're going to work as a team, how you're going to collaborate and cooperate for emotionally supportive cultures. It's not just institution, it's our funders. So this QR code is to a scoping review to an Economic and Social Research Council report published in 2022. I was lead author on. This is government funding, and it's our largest funder of socio and economic research in the UK. And the idea was that we were going to research what the emerging skills our PhD students in the social sciences really needed going forward. And I know that the ESRC expected us to say everybody needs to learn R. And one of the big findings was that we need more support, especially for students who are doing research in areas where they have lived experience. And we had to fight for that to remain in the report, but it is in the report. So in recognition, next slide, please. But we also need investment. We need redistribution. Institutions must invest in researchers who work in emotionally demanding fields. And this includes sustainable and sustained training embedded into core methods and sustained throughout our careers doing emotionally demanding research. We need access to counsellors who understand the pressures, who are there to help us build stronger careers, not to undermine us and deflect us from the difficult work. We need breathing spaces, paid leave to recalibrate, or longer research grants so that we can build an inclusive research culture, because the work that we're doing is urgently needed. It's important work. So we need training embedded in core research methods. We need it embedded in PhD inductions and in staff inductions. This needs to be mainstreamed. And this QR code takes you to the Emotionally Demanding Research Network, which is sort of Scotland's response to this. It was set up by Susie Smiley, who was a former student of mine doing a training course where emotionally demanding research was embedded within it, and Julie Riddell, and I'm currently leading the network while they're taking a sabbatical. Next slide, please. You can all join, you're all welcome. And then it's resistance. So I don't want to speak about resilience because that's putting more labour onto us, and it's reinforcing the idea that we are somehow not adequate for intellectually demanding careers, and we are. So there is tension of doing emotionally demanding research and being a first generation. I think that's my otherness, but we all have otherness that makes us feel like we don't belong. I was not able socioeconomically to not have periods that were funded, right? So I couldn't do a PhD unless it came with a stipend. I couldn't stay in academia unless I got a postdoc. And so we're driven often to reduce, to diminish the support that we need because we don't want to look extra, because we know that we're in a competitive environment. And therefore, the changes that we know are needed become difficult to fight for. They're characterized as individual problems, but actually they're systemic, they're structural, and we need collective action to challenge the culture. But we can do that. The educational culture is not done to us, it is us, and we have the power, but we have to practice taking it, and we need people in leadership roles to help us along the way. And I'm very happy to do as much of that labor as is possible. And there is good news. The people who hold leadership roles are changing. That cis academic, the male, white, private school educated, they are no longer dominant in leadership roles. They're certainly not there in our PhD cohorts. So there are opportunities. There is an audience who are willing to listen to us, and people who represent you. So they are you because they've managed to get themselves into leadership roles and also are paid to work for you. Like literally, it's my job as Associate Dean for Skill and Method to make sure that we can do research well, are in a position to influence and impact. But as we get to the Q&As, and I see some coming through, we really need to think about what we prioritize and what is the urgent action from your perspective. And this QR code is to a short paper published this year where Sharon Greenwood and I just try and make this harder work visible and give the call for action. Thank you. And can I introduce Tavisha, who is going to take the presentation forward?
Thanks, Joe. Hi, everyone. I am Tvisha Nivetia. I am a feminist, a woman. I've raised in North India, which informs a lot of like my background. I moved to Uganda with an opportunity to conduct research on intimate partner violence a few years ago, and it is my own experience of intimate partner violence that drew me very strongly to violence research, and it keeps me committed to center survivor voices as well as accountability to the communities that we work with. Currently, I support the learning team at Raising Voices, a Uganda-based organization, activist organization. I think the slides have gone ahead. Sorry. Yeah, I think the previous slide still on my positionality. Thank you. Yeah, I work with Raising Voices, which is a Uganda-based activist and feminist organization focused on preventing violence against women and children. It has allowed me to work at the intersection of research and practice and experience how the two different fields approach care and support. So that has also informed a lot of my learning. And previously, I've supported large-scale randomized evaluations in both Uganda and India on themes of violence and gender equality. I have been, I acknowledge I've had the privilege to access strong educational and professional spaces, and I try to be aware of that. Next slide. So in collaboration with the Sexual Violence Research Institute and the University of Leeds, we recently explored what does it mean to be survivor researchers and what implications does it have on our research field. I'm just going to read this quote. It is not uncommon for people who have experienced GBV in their own life to gravitate towards an active role in this topic of research. So researchers can be survivors too. We know violence is widespread, and it means that many of us engaging in this research may have experienced violence. And yet, violence is often seen as something that only happens to others. It happens to our research participants, so us versus them. At the same time, researching violence as a survivor can be hugely transformative. It can bring a lot of healing, very positive. It can deepen empathy and accountability. And yet we find in our report that this remains a really taboo topic in academia, which seems to penalize openness about lived experience. There are risks of being seen as biased because of your own experience, non-objective, and even indulgent or narcissistic if you're talking about your own experience, which can hurt, all of that can hurt one's research career and credibility. And there's also fear of how will the ethics committees respond to that openness? Will they exclude, can it lead to exclusions from the research itself? And there are several costs to this silence and stigma. It disregards the emotional impacts and needs of survivor researchers. It limits reflexivity, which we know strengthens any research. And in violence research, we train interviewers to create a rapport with our study participants and be prepared to engage with someone who's experiencing violence. And we refer them to appropriate services. But we don't have similar preparation to engage with survivor researchers who may just in our teams may open up to us about their experience. And moreover, those who share about their experiences of violence have a right to feel safe, and that they won't be excluded or penalized for disclosing their experience. Next slide. So what strongly emerged is the need to build a holistic culture of care and support in academia and research fields. So a caring culture that acknowledges trauma and is prepared to support researchers, many of whom may be survivors themselves, and many of whom may never open up because of the reasons I shared before. And we need to support peer support and self and collective care networks, some of which have been mentioned by colleagues here. We really need to support them and fund them. And at the same time, researcher well-being has to be an institutional approach, and it cannot just be an individual burden. And for this, it means that we need institutional protocols and ethical guidelines that prioritize well-being of researchers throughout the process of research, not just focusing on maybe the data collection, but also including focusing on the analysis process, even teaching about violence, and doing that without forcing anyone to share what they've gone through or why or their own experience. We need guidelines that also include the well-being of the short-term researchers who we contract as part of our research, so that it has to extend to beyond kind of staff of research institutes to people we work with. And for that, we need the will and the resources and infrastructure to support this well-being. And this is something that actually does happen. So the violence against women and violence against children field, which is adjacent to academia, where kind of I have had the privilege to work in over the last few years, already has models for this, of creating more nurturing, supportive, trauma-informed practices at the institutional level that institutionalize collective care and raising voices, Sexual Violence Research Institute initiative, healing and resilience after trauma, and all of these are some examples, and you can find some resources at the end that talk about how these organizations institutionalize collective care. Thank you so much. I'll be handing to Rennie Filet of Deakin University.
Thank you so much, Tavisha, and it's great to be here tonight talking with all of these colleagues about something that's really important to me. And I am going to speak to you about the essential role that supervisors and managers play in, I guess, providing that care for researchers. But before I start, I guess to identify myself, I'm a non-Indigenous settler here in Australia, cisgendered, heteronormative, and I guess I would identify as a middle class woman as well. I live in a regional setting, and I am very proud of the fact that I'm a lived experience researcher in both the sexual assault and family violence space, and obviously in mental health as well, which is a result of my experiences with sexual assault and family violence. I have led a really privileged existence. Although my family didn't have very much, I am well educated, and yeah, I'm a privileged woman who has been married for 30 odd years and has three children and two grandchildren and another one on the way. And I do this research at the moment, mostly because I did get into an area of research where I have lived experience, and I found that that area probably could have been better supported. As a lived experience researcher, I didn't feel very safe in the space that I was in. I found that I actually had to create the safety for myself, and that I was doing a lot to make sure that my own social and emotional well-being was as it should be. And it took me a while to realize, and probably not even truly until I started supervising students myself, that that isn't the way that it needs to be. There is certainly a role for not only supervisors and managers, but schools and faculties, ethics committees, funders, and so forth. Um, so I will move on to, I guess, what I would like to share tonight in regards to the role for supervisors and managers. I think that with the research that we've done here in Australia so far, where we interviewed 42 researchers from across the country, and then we did co-design workshops with numerous researchers as well, is that at the moment, particularly ECRs or early career researchers and research assistants are feeling very much isolated in their role. They are often looking to their supervisors to lead by example and to, I guess, be role models. And unfortunately, the problem with that is that we still are kind of existing in an environment where I guess vulnerability isn't valued. In academia, quite often it is expected that you, I guess, will manage with what it is that you are researching, and that it's, I guess, it can be seen as a problem if you're not able to manage your work. And so, if you are an early career researcher or a research assistant or a PhD student, and your supervisor or your manager is suggesting to you that there is, a problem with the fact that you are struggling with your work and maybe you should be considering another line of work, you can imagine how that makes people feel in their workplace. I think one of the most important things that needs to be done at the moment is there needs to be upskilling and training for supervisors and managers, particularly as a lot of supervisors and managers, they actually perhaps haven't received the support they themselves should have received. There are a lot of people working in research who have not had adequate supervision or management. And particularly those that have been working in sensitive settings. So I guess it begins with being upskilled and trained and being able to support your own self before you can support a team. One of the things that has become clear is that there are many barriers to being able to disclose experience, lived experience, or distress during research with supervisors and managers. And so, something that we're really focusing on is normalising conversations about researcher distress. And I apologise because I've just noticed that the QR code on my slide is covering some of my words, but what we have realized is that a true leader actually talks about vulnerability with honesty. And to show your own vulnerability is a real leadership skill. And a lot of us don't actually have that skill. So working on that area is really important. We have, and the QR code here will take you to that. We have, I guess, shared some conversation starters that managers and supervisors who are feeling really uncomfortable in the space of bringing up researcher distress, they can use these conversation starters to get the conversation going. But beyond that, I think also it's really important for supervisors and managers to actually have their own self-care plans and to, allow the rest of their team to see that they also have one, that it isn't just something that a supervisor or manager would expect of their PhD candidate or their research fellow, that it's something that they have too. And there should be a team plan that's initiated by the supervisor or the project manager. it's really important to put researcher wellbeing on the team agenda and making it a part of all meetings, but at the same time, not to the point where it's just a tick off exercise. It really needs to be a genuine discussion about what are we all doing together and individually to look after ourselves. And finally, and I know this one's a bit more of a pie in the sky, or something to aim towards, but where possible, identifying appropriate workloads. And so that might be just sharing out the workload. It might be acknowledging that there's one research assistant who has been doing all the interviews or all the transcribing, and maybe it's time to share that load so that they can take a step back and have a breath. I would now like to hand over to my colleague Genevieve Mannell over in Samoa so that she can talk to you about her area of expertise.
Okay, thanks, Renee. So I have been working on the prevention of gender-based violence for really the past 15 years around the world. So Peru, Rwanda, South Africa, Afghanistan, and then most recently Samoa, where I'm calling in from. I consider myself a fairly resilient individual and researcher, which I think is why conducting research in Afghanistan really completely blindsided me. I started doing research in Afghanistan in 2019. It was during the US occupation with an Afghan women's rights organization. And the organization had 2 shelters for women who had escaped violent situations at home. I won't give you details, but the stories from women were so much more intense than anything I'd encountered before. They were just absolutely grueling. And then all of a sudden, the US left Afghanistan in a rush. The shelters closed. We still don't know what happened to the women who were living in the shelters, who we'd interviewed. And the NGO we were working with was run almost entirely by women who all lost their jobs afterwards. And so at that point, I couldn't work. I was having nightmares. I couldn't think of anything else other than the stories of these women sort of going over and over in my head. And I couldn't concentrate. And this went on for weeks and weeks. At the time, I was really fortunate enough to have an excellent line manager who offered psychological counseling to our team. But what if that hadn't been the case? What about the staff working for women's rights organizations who had conducted the interviews for us? They were putting themselves at risk under the now Taliban government. And I felt really responsible for it. And I felt like I needed to do something at the time. So I spoke to some colleagues at other universities in the UK. All of them were doing international projects and facing sort of similar mental health challenges around their own projects. So together we decided we wanted to help others that were in similar situations. And we found some funding to do a small bit of research, like many of us have. So a survey, we held some well-being workshops, and we developed a toolkit. And the link to the toolkit is on my slide there, if anyone's interested. So the toolkit is really packed full of kind of practical strategies, I'd say, that can be used by different levels. So funders, thinking of research institutions, but then lastly, I think, is researchers themselves to address the challenges of doing sensitive or challenging research. It can really be used in any context, but today I've been asked to talk specifically about the international context. So I'll do that. So doing research in a context that's not your own, where you haven't grown up, where you don't have the resources that you normally would, I think can bring challenges for even the most seasoned researchers, right? It can, in a context, you might not speak the language, you may not have the friends and family support network that you have in your home setting. And I think when things go wrong, when there's a political situation that might be unstable, like my example with Afghanistan, things can be extremely challenging on the level of well-being. So yeah, let's see, okay. Yet, so for me, the research field has really been slow to accept this, largely because of assumptions that research is meant to be objective and not emotional, like others have talked about as well. But I think secondary trauma can really happen to anyone on a team working in challenging situations. So we have to think about field workers, but also transcribers, the people translating our data. It can even be someone holding a camera who's filming your study, right? The people that we don't often think about who are very much supporting our work. And we also often think of it as a qualitative research problem, but then I've talked to quantitative researchers who talk about sort of the weight of analyzing data on child malnutrition, for example, and knowing the extent of children who are suffering from famine across the country and how weighty that is and difficult that is to handle. So it's not just a qualitative issue. I've also talked to field workers who've been massively affected by an interview that just happened, or I've had people break down and cry at the end of a day of interviews because they've just repeated these interviews over and over again, and they've all been difficult. Others I've worked with have even experienced sexual violence while conducting field work in a country that they themselves consider to be home. And so I think it can affect absolutely everyone, and we can't make judgments about whose shoulders it falls on. And I think what's a really important point is that the onus for addressing the situation shouldn't fall on us as individual researchers or our teams, but on the institutions that support us, as Joe was saying very much at the beginning. And so far too often, I think institutions and funders actually absolve themselves of this responsibility. And I think this is especially true in international research. So contracts often create this legal divide between the research team and the implementing organization, who are the ones actually carrying out the interviews in the local language, doing the translation. But this creates sort of a fragment or a separation that's not necessarily the reality of the research. In my research in Samoa now, which is also about violence prevention, I've been trying to do things slightly differently with my team. I've been asking questions and building relationships over the long term to try and create safe spaces for people's stories to come out and to model research practices that are emotionally sensitive and aware of the challenges that everyone faces in their working lives ultimately. Just as a practical example, so early on the project, we put in place a group with the primary aim of talking about our research experiences and listening to each other. So it wasn't about work, it wasn't about what we were doing and the day-to-day work, but actually, you know, what is happening in your emotional life and how do you feel about the work that we are doing and how does that come into your life outside of work? And so another thing we do is that when we apply for funding, we systematically now add a budget line for psychological support for team members so that the resources are there in place if somebody needs them. On larger projects, I even put in a group counseling session once a month. So we have this space for discussion with the counselor on a regular basis. And it's something that people are expected to turn up to, and it's funded. But more importantly, I think it's actually sort of the informal conversations that you have about supporting a team and asking people about how they're feeling. Like just asking the question can be really, really supportive and can do a world of good. And in my own practice, I always find myself going back to the toolkit that we developed over and over again, because there's a lot of really great stuff in there. But ultimately, the more that we talk about these things and share these ideas across spaces, like with this webinar has really started that. Thank you, Renee. I think the more we do it, the less common this assumption about research is something that should be objective and not emotionally engaged can be challenged. And I think that's really important. So now I'm going to hand it over to Elizabeth Orr from Brock University in Canada.
To be called Liz. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Nursing at Brock University. I'm of settler colonial ancestry with my family heritage extending to the United Kingdom. I have the privilege to live, work, and play on the land that is the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas. This land is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Walking Belt Covenant, which was an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabeg to share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes, which are pictured here. I also have the great privilege to spend a lot of my recreational time on land that is the traditional territory of the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation. Like all settler people, I have benefited greatly from living on these lands. I acknowledge that colonial violence has and continues to negatively impact Indigenous people. and I'm currently on a journey of learning about the impact of colonialism and my role in reconciliation. Today, I'm going to start my brief chat with a story of 3 graduate students, Christine, Colin, and Mina. Christine is a PhD student in nursing. Her research explores preparedness for death among caregivers of persons with dementia. Colin is a master's student in recreation and leisure studies. His research explores participant experiences of a 3-day wilderness canoeing trip for urban dwelling young adults. Mina is a PhD student in psychology counseling, and her research explores elementary school teachers' experiences of reporting child maltreatment to Child Protective Services. One of these students experienced emotional distress related to their research work, including symptoms of secondary traumatic stress. Which one do you think it was? Most people would likely assume it was Mina or Christine, given the emotionally demanding or sensitive nature of their research topics. But I know, given the audience of today's webinar, you likely guessed these choices were too obvious. And it was actually Colin whose mental health and well-being was negatively impacted by his research work. You see, Christine had a strong network of peers and relied on the coping skills she developed as a registered nurse, working with seriously ill and patients at end of life. And Mina's supervisor was aware of her history as a childhood survivor of child maltreatment and worked closely with her to create a detailed support plan. This included access to free professional counseling and extra time built into her work study schedule so she could prevent, recognize, and manage any mental health impacts during her research. Colin's experience, however, was very different. He didn't have strong personal or institutional supports in place. During his qualitative interviews, participants shared stories of violence, racism, and abuse, topics he wasn't prepared to handle. Then, as he transcribed and analyzed the data, he had to revisit those painful stories again and again. This repeated exposure took a toll. And because the supervisory committee was mostly made up of quantitative researchers, they weren't as familiar with the kinds of risks or the kind of support Colin might need. So it's easy to see, with these additional details, how he became vulnerable to the negative impacts of his research. The stories of Christine, Mina, and Colin are composite examples based on the kinds of experience graduate students shared in their own dissertations and theses. These examples come from a scoping review I conducted of qualitative graduate research involving sensitive or emotionally demanding topics, such as trauma, violence, grief, or marginalization. In their reflective writing, many students described the emotional toll of their work, feelings of distress, burnout, and isolation. Some had strong supports in place, like attentive supervisors or access to mental health resources, but others struggled without preparation or acknowledgement from their programs. What stood out in the review was how rare it was to find formal planning around research or distress. Fewer than 5% of the dissertations and theses included an established plan to address emotional risk if it arose. And about 13% described ad hoc strategies, usually things that students came up with after distress had already started, or more general practices like reflexive journaling, which is common in qualitative research, but often not enough on its own. These patterns show that while emotional distress is a known risk, or becoming at least a known risk of this kind of work, institutional responses are often informal, inconsistent, or entirely absent. Researcher well-being needs to be treated as an essential part of the research process, not something left to chance. This work ultimately led to the creation of the Researcher Resilience Community of Practice, which I co-lead. The group began in 2021 and continues today. It brings together researchers from around the world who are engaged in emotionally demanding work, often related to trauma, violence, or marginalization. Our focus is on raising awareness about the emotional toll this kind of research can take and creating space for peer support and shared strategies. Through regular meetings, workshops, and resource sharing, we're working to shift the culture of research towards one that acknowledges and supports researcher well-being. So what can we take from this? The emotional challenges faced by graduate students doing sensitive qualitative research are real and far too often overlooked. While some students find ways to cope or are fortunate to have strong support, others are left to navigate distress on their own. We need to do better, not just as individual supervisors or programs, but across academic culture. That means making space for conversations about emotional risk, building support into research planning, and recognizing that researcher well-being is integral to ethical and sustainable scholarship. My hope is that by sharing these stories and through ongoing efforts like the Researcher Resilience Community Practice, we can help shift the culture towards one that values not just the work, but the well-being of the people doing it. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. I'm going to jump in after Liz's fantastic presentation. My name's Caitlin Proctor. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm a part-time professor at the European University Institute in Florence. I'm also a Marie Curie Research Fellow at the moment at the Geneva Graduate Institute, and I'm here with my Geneva hat on today because they've very generously been funding my work in this area. I'm an anthropologist by training, and that's the discipline that I'm mainly speaking to when in the work that I'm doing around researcher wellbeing. So I'd also like to start with acknowledging my privilege of being cisgender, heteronormative, middle class, white European, but also someone who grew up as a carer, and that's something that's really drawn me towards my research topics. I've worked and taught at universities in Switzerland, in Italy, in the UK, and the US. But I've also worked for many years and taught at universities in Palestine, and that's made me extremely aware of how different teaching and research environments influence my work. I've had the opportunity to do ethnographic research in Palestine, in Gaza, in the West Bank, also in East Jerusalem, also in Jordan, and most recently in Tunisia. And in fact, just briefly, my recent work in Tunisia, well, all of my work really is around children, youth, caregivers, and experiences of violence and loss in contexts of forced migration and ongoing conflict. But just briefly to mention, perhaps, that it's my most recent work in Tunisia, which has been with mothers on the move and small children. That's really kind of floored me, actually. Having had more than 12 years of fieldwork experience by now, I consider myself to be quite a resistive and/or resilient researcher, also having done this work in areas of improving training. But this is the first time that I was doing research as a mother myself, and I had my daughter with me during this period of fieldwork. And something about that, it really profoundly changed the experience for me. In the last 2 years, I've also been doing human rights adjacent research on the genocide in Gaza. And again, the scale and the level of the violence feels different now. And my experience of motherhood and working with many mothers who are trying to care for their children in really profoundly unsafe circumstances has been something that's really challenging. So I do think I will just mention that I think there's something quite specific to anthropology as a discipline, because really as a discipline, your success in the discipline depends on doing this very long-term ethnographic engagement, which is almost exclusively done alone. And even if you're doing that research at home or in your home environment, you're generally removed from your existing social networks because of the nature of the method that sort of demands you to be very responsive to your research participants. My own doctoral fieldwork included some extremely violent experiences that my university, the University of Oxford, hadn't trained me for, and also was not prepared to support me with in the aftermath. And that led me to engage more deeply in this work. Together with my colleague Bramwyn Spector, we founded a project called The New Ethnographer, which was about creating a space for early career researchers to talk about challenges they faced. We've recently published this book called Inclusive Ethnography, which is really a textbook that's designed to teach ethnography differently. And when we speak of inclusivity, Joe's already brought up the word inclusivity, but we're really speaking here about finding ways to do your research with compassion for yourself and an awareness of the kinds of challenges that might be specific to you in doing your research and the attributes you bring to it. Next slide, please. So I've been asked to talk a little bit about implications of researcher trauma in early career researchers especially. And just briefly, I think it's really important. Many of us, we're all talking about the same thing here, really, but it's also really important to sort of note the longevity of this issue and the fact that people have been trying for a very long time to bring about change. And it's only quite recently that I think we're starting to see these changes come through. So back in 2009, Amy Pollard, who's an anthropologist at the University of Cambridge, did a study on experiences of early career anthropologists doing fieldwork and the kinds of challenges they faced. Her study field of screams brought out a lot of really key recommendations, none of which we really saw being followed up on. Together with Bramwyn Spector and Maureen Freed, my colleagues, we did another survey in 2023 that was published last year, where we revisited the territory of Amy Pollard's work, but to look and understand if the language of trauma could be perhaps useful in taking this work forward. There's a lot in the paper about the kinds of training that ECRs do and don't have access to, the preparedness that they have for emotionally demanding research, level of support at universities, role of supervision, etc. But for now, I'll just focus on what we can say around implications for researcher trauma. So we asked participants in this survey for their subjective assessment on whether they had been adversely impacted by their fieldwork experience. And we also designed our own questions to try and explore whether researchers had post-traumatic symptoms characterized within PTSD, not to try and medicalize researcher distress. And we weren't attempting to determine, whether the duration or severity of those symptoms warranted a clinical diagnosis. That wasn't the point, but rather because we thought any evidence of these symptoms would be worthy of attention from our universities. So really going back to some of the things that Tina introduced this whole session with earlier, what we found to be very, very common among experiences of field workers were avoidance, inability to really engage with research participants on difficult topics after a certain point in time, being unable to make field notes, unable to listen to interviews or transcribe them, a constant reliance on distraction when engaging with research materials, and a tendency to take on additional projects as a bit of a distraction to avoid engaging with one's research. Intrusion was very prevalent as well, disturbing thoughts and dreams related to research content, or very strong physical reactions related to memories of research. We found reactivity to be there as well. Many reported difficulty in concentrating, difficulty sleeping, being hyper alert. Changes in mood, typically linked to guilt due to class, gender, ethnicity, access to resources, but also a really deep sense of personal shame and disappointment in the research and what outcomes the research could bring. Now, again, as my colleagues here have emphasized, there's an overall negative impact, but it's not all negative. So the negative impact that we do see is people really needing to take extended breaks from field research, and that's negative at the moment because it's not supported and it's not endorsed and it's not encouraged. So exactly as colleagues have already been emphasizing, this needs to be normalized. We need to talk about this much more and factor it into research plans. But we also saw that many people abandoned their research midway through, or indeed decided they needed to leave academia altogether. On the other hand, there's an absolutely crystal clear trajectory of those who have had those difficult experiences themselves, then being very motivated to engage in improving this for future generations of researchers, and being very motivated to do what they can within their departments or their research centres to try and bring about a better environment for those engaging in emotionally challenging research. So just the last slide, please, to conclude. So I just really want to, bring us back to this message that this is a professional concern. And to pick up on what Liz was just saying, it can absolutely affect everyone. I think there's still a very prevalent understanding that only certain types of research are emotionally demanding, or certain types of people will be affected by emotionally demanding research. And that's simply not the case, as we just saw very clearly from Liz's presentation. The implications of not paying attention to researchers' well-being will affect the ability of our colleagues to stay in this profession long term, and it also can have a very profound impact on the quality of work produced, on the integrity of work produced, and all of this has very severe overall consequences for the reputations of disciplines in academia overall. Thank you very much, and now I'm going to hand back to Jo Ferry to take us into the last section.
Yeah, thank you. Fascinating contributions from everybody. And at this point, I know some questions have been turning up, but we really want to hear from you guys. This is the opportunity to be transgressive, to not just say that change is needed, but action that. What change are we going to take forward? How are we going to take power, and how are we going to cooperate? So what needs to change within the academy?
Thanks, Jo. And we have a very short period of time for question and answers. So if anyone would like to pop anything into the question and answer section, we would be happy to answer them right now. But while we're waiting for questions to come through, I might just pop up the resources. There was a lot of discussion in the chat about people experiencing a lack of support. So just to let you know that some of the resources on the page in front of you are genuinely small networks where people get together and discuss some of the issues that they're having and how they can be better supported in that space. But as well as that, some of these resources are things like, wellbeing plans that you can share with your team and so forth. I know that with Genevieve, she has a whole toolkit here that can be used by not only researchers, but their teams, by funders as well. And the work that has been done by Tina is similar. So there's a whole heap of resources. If you jump onto the PRESTAs, or the Preventing and Responding to Secondary Trauma in Researchers, that has a heap of co-designed Australian resources as well. So depending on where you are, there are definitely some resources that can be used. And I don't think actually there's any of these resources that can't be used in a different context. It's just that we've done them in our separate countries. Is there anyone that wanted to add anything to the discussion in the last few minutes while we wait for a question?
There was a question. I think the chat function, some of the questions weren't going to everybody. So I was asked a question about how do you handle ideas being stolen, and just to sort of, I've put an answer in the chat, but if you can't access it, I just want to say it's about finding your people and being able to say to yourself that you're not going to work with people. I was told when I complained to senior people, I was told that there's a game to be played. And I decided I didn't want to play a game. But if that robbed me of success and promotion, I was happier with that than playing a game that exploited the people that were coming up behind me. And I think that commonality is there amongst leaders that are emerging right now. I think we are trying to do academia differently, but it is about finding people. It is about finding your principles, your standards for how you want to operate with it. And then that becomes the culture as we find people that share those standards and those principles. And it's really interesting. I think there's a community of practice right here that exemplifies that. And the other thing, just to say that when I feel anger and I feel frustration, I don't convert that into shame. I convert that into writing. And not all of that writing is good writing, but at least it's productive. At least it's useful for me. At least I can take that as fuel instead of as a sort of a destructive energy.
Thank you so much, Jo. That's great. And I see that there is another comment or a suggestion there's two now in the question and answer section. And so I just need to clarify, IRBs, are they like ethical review boards? Is that the European term? Okay, so perhaps one entry point might be the IRB's focus advocacy expectations to see research of wellbeing plans, workload considerations, and so forth. Yes, absolutely. And this is something that a few of us have been considering, and we've been trying to develop a few resources to be able to provide to ethics committees things that are there to help assess how much risk there might be within a project, some guidelines that they can pass on to project teams in regards to how risk of distress can be managed and so forth. So great suggestion there, Sophie. Thank you. And there's another comment about being a survivor researcher working in child protection. I've long hoped to pursue higher research grounded in my own experience, but coming from a South Asian context where child sexual violence and family abuse remain deeply taboo, it's been incredibly difficult to envision how to begin. How do we find the courage to follow a path we know is right, but feels so heavy to carry alone? And that's just such a good question. Did anyone here want to answer that?
I just want to say, and that this links into what Jo said. It is about finding the others that are doing the work that you're interested in, and building up the networks with those within those supportive environments. So other people who may have published in the field, or other PhD students, other early career researchers, and it might be that some of those aren't great, so try others. We quite often end up getting knocked back by people that we've quoted their work for ages and thought they were wonderful, and actually when you contact them, they're not. But there are other people who are like these wonderful people here. It's such a privilege to be here, and I thank you so much for asking. But that are really supportive and effective, or can refer you to a network that might be really supportive and effective for you. So it is, you have to be brave to reach out. And sometimes the people you reach out aren't the best, but there are other people there that, so it's okay, go and ask someone else. And there are lots of networks now for early career researchers on particular topics, and Tricia's network is particularly good and international. So they will also be able to help you think about where you will go.
Thank you so much. And yes, I think the Sexual Violence Research Initiative would be a great place to start. I see, Jo, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, just I think three really quick points. First of all, don't think of a project as being able to deliver all of the work that's needed, because that is overwhelming. Think about a career's worth of time. Think about the project that feels doable now, and then think about the next thing being something completely different, right? Maybe, so I teach research methods because if I taught on what I research, it would be consuming me all the time. So there needs to be light and shade. And the third thing is, some of us are drawn to these really, really difficult areas of research. We make it harder for ourselves to have academic or research practitioner careers because we're drawn to that. But that is innate, it's within us. So make peace with that. Don't fight it, but make sure that you're looking after yourself by making sure there are periods of light in your employment too.
Yeah. And there's one last question that we'll answer before we finish up tonight, and that comes in from Anna. Do you have any suggestions on new people entering this sector to be requesting or asking when commencing? And I think Genevieve or Jo, either of you might be quite well positioned, although Tina's got her hand raised. Go ahead, Tina.
It is, yeah, and perhaps someone else should answer this, but it is really helpful to be able to ask and find the right person for you to support your research. So actually asking the question about, okay, so we're interested in this topic, but actually also, how do you look after your well-being within this department, within this faculty, within this relationship, and you know, and making decisions about whether you want to work with that person based on that. But I'll let other people.
Anything to add?
I agree. I think you can ask for counselling funding. That's becoming more normalised, but also try and find somebody who's good at that counselling, because it's quite a skill base. Ask your supervisors to give you time to talk about your emotions, and if you're not in that kind of situation, try and find peers, but share the community, share the labour on that, and try and get into an organisation. I mean, we've got our emotionally demanding research network, but there are many globally, and we grow by collectivizing. So yeah, good luck. It's hard, but it's worth it. Our research work is needed so urgently, and we've all sort of implied that, but it's so needed that we have to look after each other.
Absolutely. And I would like to thank you all for attending tonight. Thank you to my colleagues who co-presented tonight. It really is important that we start these discussions, and without you, we couldn't have. So thank you very much. I have popped my email into the chat. If there is anyone that had any further questions that I would like me to pass on to anyone here, then please do get in contact, and we will either be sending out the recording or the slides to everyone who attended tonight. So thank you very much for registering, and please take care. Thank you.
Thank you.